The spotlight hit Lou Reed's face like an interrogation lamp, and in that frozen moment on a Cleveland stage in 1978, something inside him finally shattered. 5,000 voices roared his name, but all he could hear was the electrical hum, that same mechanical buzz from the psychiatric ward 19 years earlier, when electrodes had burned patterns into his 17-year-old brain. His hands were trembling, not the rock star tremor of heroin withdrawal or stage adrenaline, but something deeper, something that had been waiting 2 decades to resurface. The guitar hung heavy around his neck, and Lou Reed realized with crystalline horror that he couldn't remember the opening chord of Sweet Jane, a song he'd performed thousands of times. But the real terror wasn't the forgotten chord. It was the recognition that his mind was doing exactly what the doctors had promised it wouldn't do back in 1959, when they'd strapped him down and assured his parents that electroconvulsive therapy would cure their son's differentness. Before we dive deeper into what happened that night, a night that would change Lou Reed's relationship with performance forever, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you the untold stories behind rock's most enigmatic figures, the moments that shaped legends, and the truths that have remained hidden for decades. The Agora Ballroom in Cleveland had seen its share of rock chaos by 1978. The venue, squeezed into a converted warehouse on the city's east side, had hosted everyone from Bruce Springsteen to the New York Dolls during their hungover tours through the Midwest. But nobody who worked there had ever seen a performer arrive in the state Lou Reed was in that March evening. The venue's stage manager, Chuck Bernstein, would later tell interviewers that Reed showed up 3 hours before soundcheck, wearing sunglasses indoors and walking with the careful, measured steps of someone navigating a ship's deck in rough seas. Bernstein had worked with enough addicts to recognize the signs of heavy use, but this was different. Reed wasn't nodding off or speeding. He was present but somehow absent, his responses to technical questions arriving several seconds delayed, as if his words had to travel through some vast internal distance before reaching his mouth. The band members exchanged glances but said nothing. They'd learned years ago that questioning Lou's state was an invitation to verbal evisceration. But guitarist Jeff Ross noticed something disturbing when Reed removed his leather jacket. His hands weren't just shaking. They were performing a small, rhythmic tremor, as if some invisible current was running through his nervous system. When Lou Reed walked onto the Agora stage, the audience's cheers hit him like a physical force. He wore his uniform, black jeans, black t-shirt, black leather jacket that caught the stage lights. The sunglasses stayed on. They always stayed on. Reed's relationship with eye contact had been complicated since childhood, but after the ECT treatments, the sunglasses had become armor. The band launched into I Wanna Be Black, and for the first 2 songs, everything seemed normal by Lou Reed standards. But Jeff Ross, standing stage right, noticed that Reed's left hand was making small, involuntary movements between chord changes. Not the fluid movements of a skilled musician, but jerky, spasmodic motions, as if Reed's fingers were receiving signals from somewhere else. By the 3rd song, Street Hassle, the tremors had become visible to the front rows. Reed's hands were shaking badly enough that he was missing notes, creating dissonant accidents that weren't his intentional noise experiments, but genuine mistakes. Reed had been clean from heroin for nearly 8 months, but his body was still processing years of abuse. And underneath that, deeper and older, his brain was still carrying the scars of what had been done to it in the name of cure. 3 minutes into Street Hassle, Lou Reed stopped playing mid-verse. Just stopped. His hands fell away from the guitar, and he stood there frozen, staring out into the stage lights. The band kept playing for a few bars before the bassist signaled them to stop. 5,000 people fell silent in seconds. Lou Reed stood center stage, motionless except for the visible trembling in his hands. His mouth was moving, but no sound came through the microphone. Chuck Bernstein later described it as the most disturbing thing he'd ever seen in 20 years of venue management. A performer completely locked inside his own head while thousands watched. What was happening inside Lou Reed's skull was something neurologists would later identify as a possible delayed manifestation of ECT-induced seizure disorder. The electrical storms artificially created in his adolescent brain had created pathways, scar patterns in neural tissue that could reactivate under stress or exhaustion. Reed wasn't having a full seizure, but he was experiencing what's known as a partial focal seizure, where part of the brain misfires while the person remains technically conscious but unable to process their environment. From the audience's perspective, they were witnessing a rock star's breakdown. But the truth was more tragic. This was a 17-year-old boy named Louis Allen Reed, strapped to a table in Creedmoor Psychiatric Hospital, feeling electricity course through his brain while doctors and his own parents watched, believing they were saving him from homosexuality, from differentness, from the crime of not being the son they'd expected. And now, 19 years later, that boy was still there, still feeling the voltage, still unable to make his body obey. The tremor intensified, traveling up his arms. Someone in the front row shouted, "Lou!" as if calling him back. The sound seemed to penetrate. Reed's head turned slowly toward the voice, and then he did something nobody expected. He reached up with shaking hands and removed his sunglasses. The stage lights hit his unprotected eyes, and the audience gasped. Lou Reed's eyes were streaming with tears, and the expression on his face wasn't the cool rock star mask, but something raw and terrified and entirely human. Jeff Ross moved first, putting a hand on Reed's shoulder and speaking directly into his ear. Reed nodded slowly, and Ross guided him toward the stage exit. But Lou Reed stopped after 3 steps. He turned back to face the audience, and when he grabbed the microphone, his voice came through quiet but clear. "They tried to fix me when I was 17. Electroshock therapy. My parents signed the papers because they thought I was broken. I've been putting myself back together ever since, but some pieces don't fit anymore." The venue remained silent. This wasn't part of any Lou Reed performance anyone had witnessed. This was confession, the kind of vulnerability that Reed had spent his entire career avoiding through layers of irony and aggression. He continued, his voice shaking. "Some nights I feel the electricity still, in my hands, in my head. The doctors said it wouldn't cause permanent damage. The doctors lied." Then Lou Reed set his guitar down carefully and walked off stage. Not dramatically, not angrily, just walking away with the same measured, careful steps he'd used entering the venue. The audience remained silent for perhaps 10 seconds, then erupted into applause that wasn't quite approval or disapproval, but acknowledgement of having witnessed something unrepeatable. Backstage, Lou Reed collapsed into a chair and put his head in his still trembling hands. Chuck Bernstein asked if he needed a doctor. Reed laughed, a harsh, bitter sound, and said, "I've had enough doctors for 10 lifetimes." The band filtered in, settling into uncomfortable silence. It was Jeff Ross who finally asked, "What happened out there, Lou?" Reed looked up, and for once in his life, he told the truth without irony. He told them about Creedmoor Psychiatric Hospital, about being 17 and terrified and strapped to a table, about his parents watching through glass as electricity turned their son into a convulsing stranger. About waking up afterward unable to remember his own address, unable to recall large portions of his own history. About the subsequent treatments, each one taking more pieces of his memory until he existed in a perpetual state of reconstruction, trying to remember who he'd been before they'd tried to fix him. The psychiatric treatment of homosexuality in 1950s America was sanctioned torture disguised as medicine. Lou Reed's parents weren't monsters. They were ordinary middle-class Americans who believed what doctors told them, who trusted the psychiatric establishment when it promised their son's differentness could be corrected. But what ECT actually did was create trauma layers that Reed would spend his entire life processing through music. Every song about alienation, every lyric about institutional control, every verse about identity and its destruction, all traced back to Creedmoor and the tables and the electrodes. Medical records that would surface decades later revealed that Lou Reed had undergone nearly 36 ECT treatments over 8 months, a protocol that even by 1959 standards was considered aggressive. Each treatment sent 70 to 120 volts through his temporal lobes, inducing grand mal seizures, a process designed to reset the brain's chemistry by scrambling its electrical patterns. The cumulative effect on a 17-year-old brain was catastrophic. Reed emerged with significant memory gaps, a persistent tremor, and a relationship with his parents that never fully recovered. In the Agora's dressing room, Lou Reed's confession unlocked something in the others. Chuck Bernstein mentioned his own cousin, institutionalized in the 1960s for being gay, subjected to similar treatments. Jeff Ross talked about his sister, given ECT without real consent, emerging unable to play the piano she'd studied for 15 years. Stories emerged, each one a variation on the same theme. Psychiatric medicine used as punishment for differentness. Lou Reed listened with focused attention, and something in his face shifted. The terror receded, replaced by recognition that he wasn't alone in carrying this damage. The promoter made an unexpected decision. Instead of demanding refunds, he offered the audience a choice. Anyone who wanted money back could get it. Anyone who wanted to stay would get a special acoustic performance in 2 hours. Most of the audience stayed. They hadn't come just for hits. They'd come for the Lou Reed experience, and they'd gotten something more raw and real than any planned performance could provide. 2 hours later, Lou Reed returned to the Agora stage with just an acoustic guitar and a stool. No sunglasses, no leather armor, no band to hide behind. About 3,000 people had chosen to stay for whatever came next. Reed sat on the stool, adjusted the microphone, and said, "I don't know if I can do this, but I'm going to try." What followed was 90 minutes of Lou Reed performing songs he hadn't played in years, including several Velvet Underground tracks he'd actively avoided in his solo career. But he changed them, adding verses, modifying lyrics, turning songs audiences thought they knew inside out. He explained between verses that he'd first tried heroin at 18, less than a year after his last electroshock treatment, seeking something that would make him feel anything other than the numb blankness the ECT had left behind. The audience listened in near-complete silence. This wasn't entertainment. It was testimony, witnessing, the sharing of trauma that American culture had spent decades pretending didn't exist. On the Agora stage, Lou Reed talked about returning to Syracuse University after his hospitalization and finding that large portions of his previous semesters had been erased from his memory, about having to relearn the guitar because his muscle memory had been disrupted, about the persistent tremor that made him avoid piano, an instrument he'd loved as a child, because his hands couldn't control the keys anymore, about the nightmares that plagued him for years, where he was back on the table, electricity coursing through him while he tried to scream. About developing a stage persona, the sunglasses, the leather, the aggressive cool, specifically to hide the residual effects of trauma he couldn't fully control. Every Lou Reed performance was, in some sense, a continuation of the electroshock table experience. Being observed, being judged, having to perform a version of yourself while protecting the damaged core beneath. The difference was that on stage, Reed controlled the electricity. He controlled when to shock the audience and when to soothe them. It was power reclaimed, agency restored, even if imperfectly. As the acoustic performance stretched past midnight, Lou Reed's hands gradually stopped shaking. The act of playing, of controlling the narrative, of transforming private pain into shared art, seemed to calm the neurological storm that had overwhelmed him. This was what Reed had discovered in his 20s, that performance could be therapeutic in ways that actual therapy never was, that transforming trauma into art created distance and meaning where psychiatric medicine had only created more damage. When Lou Reed finally ended the acoustic set at 1:15 in the morning, the remaining audience gave him a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. He didn't smile or bow. He simply nodded, acknowledging what had passed between performer and audience, and walked off stage. Backstage, Reed sat holding his acoustic guitar, staring at nothing. Chuck Bernstein asked if he was okay. Reed considered the question seriously before answering, "I don't know, but I think I will be." It was the most honest thing anyone had heard him say in years. The Cleveland performance did change something in Lou Reed's relationship with his own history. In subsequent interviews, though never in extensive detail, he began acknowledging the electroshock treatments, the psychiatric hospitalization, the attempts to cure his sexuality. He never named Creedmoor specifically during his lifetime, protecting his parents' memory or perhaps his own privacy. But the outline was clear enough for those listening. Gay activists and psychiatric survivors began reaching out, sharing their own stories, creating a community of recognition around Reed's music. Reed responded by quietly supporting LGBTQ organizations, making donations anonymously, occasionally showing up at fundraisers. It wasn't traditional activism. Reed was never going to be a spokesman. But it was acknowledgement, the recognition that his survival meant something to people who'd endured similar attempts at erasure. The tremor in Lou Reed's hands never completely disappeared. Footage from later performances shows it clearly in moments of stress or exhaustion, a physical reminder of what had been done to his nervous system. He learned to work around it, adapting his guitar technique, making the tremor part of his distinctive playing style. But in interviews about his technique, Reed never explained the real reason. Some things remained too private or too painful. The Agora performance became legendary in Lou Reed circles, but not in the way his famous confrontational shows did. This one was talked about quietly, passed through fan networks as a story about vulnerability rather than rock star behavior. When Reed died in 2013, the Cleveland performance was mentioned in several obituaries as a turning point. The night Reed stopped hiding behind his persona and allowed audiences to see the damage beneath. Laurie Anderson, Reed's partner for the last 21 years of his life, was one of the few people Reed discussed Cleveland with in detail. In interviews after his death, she revealed that Reed had considered the Agora breakdown both the worst and best night of his performance career. Worst because it exposed his vulnerability in ways he'd spent decades avoiding. Best because it freed him from the exhausting work of pretending the damage wasn't there. Anderson understood that Reed's entire artistic project had been about transforming medical and cultural trauma into something that could be witnessed, shared, survived. The final years of Lou Reed's life were marked by what Anderson described as increasing peace, a gradual softening of the defensive aggression that had characterized his public persona. His Tai Chi practice seemed to calm the tremor that had plagued him since adolescence, giving him control over his body in ways that decades of medical intervention had failed to achieve. When Lou Reed died on October 27, 2013, the public obituaries focused on his musical legacy. But among psychiatric survivors and LGBTQ activists, his death prompted different conversations about what he'd survived before ever becoming famous. Reed's music had given them language for experiences that American culture still struggled to acknowledge. His public breakdown in Cleveland had validated the body's right to remember what the mind tried to forget, had demonstrated that trauma's effects weren't weakness, but testimony. The tremor in Lou Reed's hands that March night in Cleveland was many things simultaneously: neurological damage from obsolete psychiatric practices, body memory of teenage trauma, and ultimately, a form of truth-telling that words alone couldn't accomplish. The 5,000 people who witnessed Reed's crisis participated in something rare. Not spectacle, but ceremony. Not entertainment, but genuine human connection across the performer-audience divide. They saw Lou Reed not as rock star or icon, but as a damaged person who'd turned his damage into something that helped others survive their own.